And here we go. I'm delighted to introduce Chris Hinojosa, whose talk forms part of our current season of activity, Lincoln Live, and the Lincoln Creates Network program, which brings together and celebrates a breadth of critical and applied creative practices. This series is designed to support creative professional development, peer learning, and networking, as well as critical conversations and debate. With the current situation prompting us to move more of our talks online, we now actually have quite the privilege to be able to release these LCN talks to a much wider audience. Chris is concerned with the stage as an opportunity for the suspension of disbelief, the reclamation of space, and fantasy as mechanisms for shifting power dynamics. During her LCN talk, Chris will speak about her old and much more recent work, as well as upcoming work, which looks primarily at her experience as a Latinx trans woman exploring modes of normalizing public conversations around trauma, specifically as it relates to trans identity. Working in photography, vocal performance, and audio production, Chris uses the stage, sometimes even public sites, to allow the body to become greater than it is in isolation, shifting everyday dynamics to allow fantasy to become a personal reality. Just a quick trigger warning as well. During the talk, Chris will be addressing topics and events of extreme phobias and violence against the trans community, which of course some of you will find distressing. Without further ado, I think I can pass it over to Chris. Hello.
Hi. Thanks so much for having me, and everybody at Matches of the Future. I really appreciate it.
It's not a problem at all. How have you been?
I've been great. I've been so busy.
But
this is a very welcome change and shift in the way that I've been sort of organizing my week. So I'm quite excited. Yeah.
Really good stuff. How is sort of COVID affected your art production, or just like you working as an artist? I know A4 Sounds, who you're going to be doing the residency, who you're doing the residency with, sorry, currently, has done really, really well in supporting you throughout this time.
Yes, they are literally amazing. If you don't know A4 Sound Studios in Dublin, please go to their website and check them out. I could not be more blessed and highly favored, because A4 Sound literally saved me. They do such great work. The stuff that they put out is really amazing. They've been super supportive through COVID. This residency was supposed to be much shorter, and it's actually been elongated, and supported me through that, which has been amazing. There's been all kinds of crazy things that have been thrown into the world because of COVID. And I'm just really happy that it didn't actually totally derail the work. In fact, maybe it's even made it stronger, and it's given me a lot of opportunities to spend more time like here and in getting into the community and talking and thinking through that work much more critically. So it's been great, yeah.
Sounds like you found a bit of a home in Dublin as well.
Oh
That's fair to say.
Yeah. Absolutely. Come to Dublin, it's fun.
Really good to hear. I think it's about time we should actually move over to the presentation. So if you want to just start sharing your screen, I can switch off my video and we could just go ahead with things.
Sure. All right. Give me just a second.
No problem at all.
Oh, Bob, can you pass me the mic?
The mic?
I can't share.
Okay, let me just have a look. I'll just turn you into the host here.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. All right. All right. Can you see it?
Yep, looks good to me.
Okay, great. So hi, everybody. My name is Chris Hinojosa. I'm an artist who was born in Corpus Christi, Texas, and I'm now based in Dublin, Ireland on residency with A4 Sound Studios. I wanted to take this opportunity to do things a little bit differently and start by talking about my background as a photographer and lead us on to how I got to be making the work that I am today. I've pulled a small selection of photographs from my archive, as that's where my love of photography began many years ago, was with portraiture. When I first started really critically thinking about image making, I was always questioning identity, the body, and masculinity. And mind you, these slides are gonna go, we're gonna jump back and forth a bit through time, so the breadth of work jumps around within the past 10 years. I spent a lot of time photographing men, my friends and family, and then naturally myself. I had been really obsessed with the representation of men in photography and perhaps the romanticized aspects of photographing. The shifting power dynamics between myself as someone who was really effeminate and my subjects as they were placed behind the lens and thus putting me in control of their depictions. And so both of these photographs are from around 2015. Through working with a large format camera, I'd started to take more time in the process of shooting and began to realize that these portraits were becoming more a reflection of myself than those behind the lens, and started to shift my practice to focusing on my relationships and reflecting on my identity. The trauma I sustained as a visibly queer young boy and the landscapes that my life was set in. So this is actually an image from a series of work called With Love and Faltering, which I started in 2011. And this image is of my grandfather on my mother's side. And for about a period of like I guess when I go back, I still take photos of them, but I haven't been back in so long. But as I would continuously come back home, I would photograph my mother or my grandmother and my grandfather's relationship. And so this is one of the photographs from that series.
Hey, Chris. Got a little question for you. This is more probably in the formal aspects of your work. I was curious to know how you sort of compose the images that you end up snapping. Because there seems to be a lot of sort of informed by, I sort of take it as like a history of painting or something like that. I don't know if that's correct to say, but there's a lot of focus on the sort of light and shadow, as well as just where they're composed on the sort of page as well. I don't know if you want to share a little bit more about your camera work.
Sure, yeah. So I work typically with a large format camera, which if you're not familiar, a large format camera is just a larger format than 35 millimeters. So it's not actually handheld. The camera has to be on a tripod and it's quite large. It's the kind of camera where you throw a cape over your head and you have to look at the viewfinder, the ground glass, and then it takes about 3 minutes to make a photograph, but it can take longer. So actually during the process, there's a lot of time spent talking to the people behind the camera. And I think naturally that sort of evolved for me in my practice is to me primarily wanting to use that method to photograph to better get to know my subjects, but also to sort of give them something in return. As for your reference to painting, I think I've always been really obsessed with light and the way there's something about romanticist paintings that I really enjoy. I think like Dutch master paintings are gorgeous. But there's something about that feels very soft, and I think that's probably just my point of view as a photographer as well that comes through in the photographs. I think of image making in a very tender way. It's like something that's quite intimate. And so with that, I think just naturally comes as sort of these depictions. And the way that they've been placed in the page, in my practice, I often use the photo book as a way to get thoughts out in terms of sequencing and thinking through how images play together. And so that's sort of just something I do on Photoshop even. I don't actually physically make the books anymore, I used to. Maybe I will in the future, but as a way to sort of curate the way that I make, I think I always put it into a book format and then start to pull and move things around.
just before you got to this image, I was about to say there's a lot in the sort of domestic space as well.
Yes, I think the settings of my immediate space have always been really interesting to me. And I think actually when I first started photographing, working within the home or the bedroom or the bathroom, it just felt like a natural pull, because that's probably where I spent most of my time thinking about myself. And then as I continued to photograph, I started to branch out to landscapes. And there was actually a point where I was only making environmental portraits and landscape photographs, which we're about to see. Through the years, I have been lucky to be able to experience many cultures, as my practice in life has taken me to many places. To name a few of these spaces: Japan, China, Scandinavia, the States, the UK. Having this cultural knowledge has also greatly informed my practice. Seeing not only the divide between how gender and sexuality are treated in the various countries where I've lived, but also learning how to navigate those spaces for myself and reflect on the performance of self in various ways. So in the past 10 years, I've lived in so many places, and thinking through also transitioning, which was more recent, but doing the work to get to the sort of comfortability of the self. I always had to understand, how my body as someone who is more femme was treated in social situations and in different cultures. So this image here is level 7 of Mount Fuji in Japan. This is not the summit. So I did make it to the summit. And I do have a photo of that, but it's not in this slide.
What sort of prompted you to move so many times throughout the sort of earlier years?
Yeah, that's a really good question. It's mostly my personal life. I was in a very committed relationship for quite a while with my ex, and they had taken a job to China, which I have a series about called When to Leave, which you can view on my website. And that body of work really sort of documents the falling out of our relationship. He was quite abusive. So the shift from sort of learning how to live my life with someone so entangled, and then having to sort of leave it and leave everything that came with that behind, in order to take care of myself, but also to forward myself as an artist and to do the things that I wanted. I ended up moving quite a bit. So I was stationed in Zhengzhou in China, and then when we broke up, I left to Shanghai, and then Shanghai got a job, went to Japan, I've been everywhere. And then of course, with just my practice as well, I've had a great opportunity to, do traveling residencies or grants and that, which has greatly informed my practice as well. And I'll, of course, where you and I met, Bob, at Goldsmiths to do my master's. And so some of these photos are from around that time. So these are in Shanghai, and the ones previous we just saw were in Japan. And these buildings were in the backyard of my living space. It's a neighborhood called Guangfuli, and Guangfuli is it's a community of people who have owned the deeds to their homes for hundreds of years, really, or like 100 years. And these homes are being torn down by the government in order to create new real estate. And so people have to live in there. There physically has to be a body in the houses, otherwise they'll come and bulldoze, which is why you see all this rubble. But because this was my immediate community, it also has its own self-sustaining market. They created everything they needed within the same space. And so I would shop at that market. And so I actually ended up spending quite a bit of time with these people. But I was doing this, I was living here and on my own and trying to figure things out. After my breakup, I was really upset and depressed. And I found that photographing these sort of began to get me out of not photographing and back into the world of art making, because I had taken a break for about a year.
really like this image. Don't know what it is about it. Is it, I don't know if it's a bit of a basic question or something, but like, is it fair to say that there's sort of, there's a very definite change in the tone and mood of your photography? And I'm assuming, of course, that reflects the emotional states that you would have been bouncing around over this period of time as well.
Absolutely. I think that my practice is very cathartic in that way. And I find that my work has always been really vulnerable. And I guess I always work from the self first. So to be able to like learn to, or I guess I didn't really have to learn to open myself up to things for art. I just sort of did it. That was like my natural way of making. And I was accused of being a romanticist for many years. Which is probably true. But I think for me, it was the most natural way of making. This photo is ancient. It's probably one of the first self-portraits I ever made in Baltimore during my undergrad when I was first learning how to use a camera. Throughout this span of 10 years, I kept coming back to self-portraiture as a way to mark my evolution. Being both the subject and the maker, I engaged in various elements of self-fashioning, representing myself in the midst of shifting subjectivity and identity, producing images which were simultaneously unguarded and performative. Photography became my safe space for exploring and challenging the parts of myself I had previously been uncomfortable with, as well as vocalize issues around gender, sexuality, and create representation for myself. So I think this also just comes through in the, sort of in the way that I was raised in Texas, being from a small, I guess it's a city, it's not really a city in my eyes, but being from such a small town and being so unflinchingly queer my entire life. Like everyone around me knew I was queer before I did. I did. And it was really quite frustrating because I was endlessly bullied. And I sort of had to learn how to take that on and be able to like, you know, live my life. And so documenting myself was a natural move to sort of look at what that meant. What does it mean for me to be the person that I am, and what is the evolution of that? And I feel like I come back to that quite often because I feel like just when I'm beginning to know myself, or just when I'm beginning to feel comfortable, something in me is stirred again. And so the images that we just seen from the past 3 slides, it's about 5 or 6 years in between all of these images.
I think this is one of your strongest images that you've made. I remember seeing this in, he was in first year in university, and I can't remember what type of fabric you had printed it on. Not fabric, sorry. What type of screen you had printed it on, but you'd like blown it up. Huge thing. It really dominated the space. Yeah.
If I had printed the piece on Perspex, so it was a reflective surface, so when you would walk up to it, you would actually see yourself in those blacks. And this was another piece that was made as like a sort of closing to the series of Around My Ex, and really sort of giving myself the closure to walk away from that and say, okay, you know, it's done. Like I'm walking away from that. And this is sort of how I felt at the end of it, you know. So this image is from a series of work from my project entitled Pearl. The images document the process of my transition through the eyes of the men who I'd met on dates, who would often describe how I should dress myself in order to better pass. Passing meaning to look like a biological female. This project plays with the politics of passing, and some of the images are dressed by myself. This slippage between the desire of these men and my own journey to discover my identity through dressing plays with the viewer's ideas of the self. In each image and audience, the audience is met with a gaze, an attempt to maintain my own subjectivity through the objectifying gaze of desire that these men cast. This image is titled Ya basta hijos de puta, which means enough motherfuckers. And so this was the first image that I had shot for the process, or the process of the beginning of the works. And at the time, I wasn't really sure about, the whole entirety of the project or what it would be, but I knew that I needed to start allowing myself to document this marked change in myself. And, I don't know that I would say that, but even at the moment, at that time that I knew I wanted to transition or that I was aware of my transition, I just knew that I needed to start to photograph. I'll scroll through some of these.
Just talk a little bit about the markings on your body there.
Yeah, so these, I had a meeting with a plastic surgeon, and I spoke with him and asked him to markate a breast augmentation on myself. And actually, I learned quite a bit about surgeries and gender-affirming surgeries and plastic surgeries, facial feminization, and a lot of those types of things. And it was actually really interesting because there's so much information that isn't readily apparent. Like there's a certain amount of tissue one needs to have. So usually trans women take estrogen for 2 years to build up that sort of tissue so they can then have a breast augmentation. It was actually really eye-opening to me, I think, because having him look at my body in such a scientific way also made me hyper-aware of how I look at my body. We definitely had a conversation about the unevenness of how asymmetrical things are on my body. And it was a really intense, like scrutinizing moment. But I think it was really, which was like maybe a little bit damaging, but also really interesting to sort of sit and see someone whose profession is to literally create an avatar of the person, and how they look at with fresh eyes at a body like mine. So this photograph was also one of the first few I shot, and at the time I was thinking a lot about Jeff Wall's photograph, Picture for Women, which is an image of him photographing himself with his studio mate, and she staring at him, staring at himself, photographing. And so this is titled Picture for Men, which is just the flip. So in my work, I also reference realness and what I call class drag. Coming from a low-income background as a person of color, I challenged the performativity of wealth and the class system prevalent in the UK, which was one of the first things that I had become acutely aware of when I moved. And so this image was taken at a private club in Mayfair, which I had been invited to, and I'll speak a little bit more on that later.
And this was one of the things that I was going to ask about before you actually moved on to these, was how did moving to London, which is in a way the sort of epicenter of hypercapitalism, affect you as a person, as well as an artist, especially because the backdrop that where we would have been studying at that point in time was in Deptford, and then you've got this stark contrast Mayfair area where you're traveling to do some of the work as well.
Yeah, I think London is a really important context to this work, because there's so much about London that I struggle with still even, and I'm thinking through. what it means to be an artist or in the arts in London is also quite different from what it means to be in the arts in another city. There's kind of a game that one plays in the art world in London, and I think we're all very acutely aware of it. But also the ability to have access through art, and to sort of class drag, again, is the term that I'll use, sort of to be able to perform, to look at your performativity and say, you know, oh, I don't come from money, I don't have any money, but I can look like I do. And that sort of goes back to sort of the idea of realness, which comes out of ballroom culture and also trans culture, the ability to like, to pass as something that you probably wouldn't be able to accomplish just given the circumstances that you were born into. And I think that that's something that a lot of trans women of color can relate to, and I certainly do. And thinking about how being in London gives you an opportunity to not only explore the arts in a very hot, like every day of the week you can go see new art, or you can do something culturally interesting. Whereas if you live in a place like Corpus Christi, where I'm from, you know, you go down to the Red Lobster, you go to the movies, you go to La Palmera, the mall, like there's not much options. And also because it's so monocultural where I'm from, there's not much growth in terms of social politics and things like that. So while London, I think, was affirming in some ways, it was also drastically problematic. Like I find that a lot of people say, oh, you know, London's so queer, it's so amazing, like stuff that I address in my work shouldn't be happening there. I'm like, well, it's just like any other city. And I think that we get really comfortable thinking that, you know, just because we're in a place that has a tag like London, doesn't mean that these issues aren't prevalent. And I think also like starting my transition, living in London was actually really interesting too, because I had divorced myself from so much of my hometown. I actually found myself thinking a lot more about my family and the women in my family and how they portrayed themselves when I was growing up and how they portray themselves now, and sort of the split between those things. Like, you know, what is it to be a strong Latina? Like, what is that? Diane will tell you, my mother, but also, you know, really taking that on board with my depictions of myself as well, and thinking about, you know, who are the iconic women that I look to, or who are the iconic women in my community that I look to, and how do I think of myself as someone who can echo those things. And I think actually a lot of what I'm pulling out in these photographs comes from my mother and my grandmother, which is funny because they're both of them. I think my mom and my grandmother are quite docile, but you know, I'm super extra, so here it is. But
I think this series of work as well is definitely your most sort of confident work. Like it puts a stand out there, you know, about you and your identity. I think it's very forthcoming.
Yeah, I think it's very. I think this way of working was very coming back to basics, in fact, because at this point it had been quite a while since I'd made a photograph, and then to put myself in front of the camera again, it's very difficult to do that. Like, after you look at yourself for so long, you get really upset and frustrated with all the things about yourself and all the things you want to change. But I knew also that this was a marked change for me. It was a big moment in my evolution. I knew that by photographing myself, I would force myself to then be more, I guess, aware or just forthcoming with my gender and the way that, maybe not even just my gender, just the way that I think and am. And I think making this work definitely taught me a lot of things about, you know, all the things that come with transitioning, like having to learn how to be seen in a new light in a community, how to learn how other people will look at you, the sort of things that you took for granted before but are now so different, because you know, now I'm presenting as a trans woman. I don't get all the privileges I used to get as an effeminate queer man. So this image is a behind the scenes image of my film La Morena. In this 16mm film, I tell the story of a trans escort I met early in my transition, who would always talk about how she would be paid to go out with a lot of posh British men in these fancy private clubs. At the time, I'd received a grant from a private club in Mayfair, the one which you'd just seen several images from. And I was invited to a dinner to present my work. I was given strict instructions on how I should dress myself: a suit jacket, tie, and loafers. I decided to go in a dress, full makeup, and heels. At the end of the evening, a man at the bar asked me to have sex with him in exchange for £100. He'd spent the evening going on about Latinx women and how they're great cooks and sexy, like every stereotype in the book. I asked the club to photograph their space afterwards and secretly shot this film. So the dance in the film comes from Veracruz, Mexico, and is traditionally done in a folklorico dress. And folklorico is like a traditional Mexican dance, and the dresses are gorgeous. They're these three-tiered dresses that have these huge circle skirts, and we sort of wave the skirts, and they sort of look like flowers blooming as they're dancing. And the lyrics of the song La Morena talk about the beauty of tanned Latina women. In my practice, I use a stage, sometimes a public site like this one, to allow the body to become greater than it is in isolation, shifting everyday dynamics to allow my fantasies to become reality. And I apologize that we're not showing you the video, but you can view the video over at my website. Both of the videos that I'll talk about tonight will be public there. So if you want to see what that looks like, you can hop on over there.
Yeah, apologies about that. We can't seem to stream like a high quality version of the videos. But this one, Kamehameha, is amazing, and you guys should check it out. This is like definitely my favorite. Chris talked about it.
So this piece is entitled Kamehameha. My 90s girls were at that. Like Kamehameha takes its name from the popular 90s anime Dragon Ball Z, with the feature power move of its hero, which is Kamehameha. The word miha means daughter or darling, and it's often used towards young children and close family as a term of endearment. It's also my chosen name. The piece takes place in Deptford High Street in South London, a space where I'd received a lot of harassment from passers-by due to my appearance. In the piece, I stage a Vogue performance, treating the high street as a runway, celebrating my body and Vogue. And so I had this crazy idea once upon a time, after I was super fed up, you know, every day walking to my studio and having to get spat at or yelled at or called after or all kinds of things, like grabbed. There's so many things that I experienced. I said, you know what? She's gonna get herself a sequence jumpsuit and she's gonna take it down to town. She was like boot the house down, like queen, serving it all the way down the street. And it was actually a crazy experience. I don't know if I would do it again. I mean, I probably would in a different space, but whiskey goes a long way. And I had a small crew. It was just one of my best friends or two of my really good friends, one filming and the other one kind of helping him so he didn't fall over. And just, it's quite difficult because he's moving backwards and he's not able to see where he's going. And so I'm going straight in and I never break the gaze. This is very intense. And as you can see in the image, there's lots of people staring at me being like, what the heck is going on? So if you'd like to check out that film as well, it's over on my website at christopherhinojosa.net. So these next few slides are documentation from my solo show, Pearl, as part of You Amuse Me, I Frighten You, which was curated by Camille Brechignac and produced by B. DeWitt, Ashley Barris Gallery in tandem with a show with artist Tyler Aish. And so this was my first London solo, and we worked so hard to bring this together, and it was such an amazing experience. We had such a fabulous space last June. It's kind of crazy to think it's already like been a year. But this is one of this table was made by Leonard Kadid, who's a designer in France. And we commissioned that table, and I created all these photographs to lay out onto it. And then you can sort of see these images there on the wall are printed on a pearlescent perspex. So when you look and when you walk in front of them, they're quite glittery. And then we have that black box there was showing both of the films, which we just discussed. And on the inside, we have another image. It's a better picture of the black box. And then inside the black box, you see this image here on the left, which is also printed on perspex. So it's like a mirrored finish. So when you walk in front of it, you actually see yourself while you're looking at myself. And then the image on the right is also from my show, in which I staged my performance Bésame Mucho, in which I performed a monologue around an assault experience I had in London. And then I sang the karaoke Cesaria Evora version of the popular love song Bésame Mucho to the viewers while I was dancing on all the men in the audience. As the song reaches its climactic point, a planted performer slaps me as I'm dancing on him, which ends the performance. Me dancing on the men. And then after the slap. So this image is from my degree show. The work is entitled I Am Raining, which is a piece I performed for the degree show, and I've recently re-performed as part of Gender RIP's post-mortem party here in Dublin. The performance starts with a monologue around trans panic and the recent murders of trans women in America. In the degree show version, I sing Bohemian Rhapsody, and my entire audience sang along with me. So it was actually a really powerful moment. And for those of you who are not familiar with trans panic is sort of the excuse that men use, or persons who engage in or discover that a trans woman is in fact trans, and then assault them, and they say, oh, well, it was trans panic, I didn't know that they were trans, which is just terrible. And this is a, excuse me, this is a performance called Coyote Ballad 1, which happened in between the time I was in London and transitioning over to here. It was with Sophia Vienna and Marta Melia, who run a place that fosters us, which is a traveling sort of nomadic exhibition. They find these spaces that used to be like homes for people or community spaces. And they create works, or they commission works for these spaces, and they have dialogues around them. And there's usually an element of food being made, which is really nice because it feels very, you feel very held. And the piece, I've mixed an audio track about Selena Quintanilla, who is a famous pop star from my hometown. And I also talk about what it's like to grow up in a small Texas town. And I draw parallels between Selena Quintanilla and myself, dressed as a coyote. So there's like a play on words there, thinking about actual coyotes and people who cross the border. So the next few slides are just some of the few stories I've come across regarding trans murder and assault in the last year alone. Each of these stories is tragic, heinous, and senseless. I'm including them here because I feel it's important to say these women's names and to tell their stories so that we may begin to heal as a community and change the way that our bodies are seen. And I'm just going to reiterate the trigger warning there because the next few slides are while there's nothing that's going to be hard to look at physically, I will be talking in depth about these situations. So this image is of Malaysia Booker, who was a 22-year-old African-American transgender woman who was assaulted and then murdered a month later in Dallas, Texas. The assault on her was captured in a video that was widely shared, sparking national attention. And it's probably one of the only instances of trans assault that people are familiar with, because a month before she was murdered, social media did its rounds with this several videos of her being attacked by a mob of people. And unfortunately, during the same time, there was another trans woman named Shynal Lindsay, whose body was found in the same lake. So Dallas really has a problem with trans women, which is very close to where I'm from. It's not that close, it's like 8 hours, but it's still Texas. So this is Alexa Negron. She's age 29 and was also harassed on social media, filmed and shot at by 3 18-year-old men in Puerto Rico. So this story didn't get any national attention or international attention, but it was a big story, I think, in Puerto Rico. In the film that went around on social media, you can actually see it's taken by the men who shot at her, and her body was found there laying in the grass the next morning. And nothing has been done about that situation either. The same is true of Malaysia Booker. Jesusa Chucha Fidel Ventura Reyes, better known as Chucha, was a 25-year-old trans woman who was killed in the Mexican state of Veracruz, which is where the folklorico dance to the song La Morena comes from. She went missing on the night of May 17th, and her family contacted local police 24 hours after her disappearance. The authorities found her severed head in a cooler in front of the town hall, and her body was found discarded in a street elsewhere in the city. These types of really heinous murders are very common in the stories around the research that I've done into this growing pandemic of hate. And so it's not just like an isolated thing, it's something that is very common, like unbelievably common. There are hundreds of stories about this. And the fact that I get so angry thinking about it, because it's just like, this is something that should be in international news. This is something that people should be like doing something about. And yet here we are, like without there's like nobody doing anything.
It's so disturbing how the gaze on these women when trans people, full stop, is so strong and so fetishized or whatever else when they are alive, and as soon as they are afflicted with that violence, suddenly it's invisible.
Absolutely, trans women are objectified and thought of as, you know, second-class citizens. Like we have to endure the gaze of these mostly men, or what we call chasers. We have to endure the constant daily need to perform the self and to have like the strength to be able to continue to perform self, even though you know all these terrible things are happening. It's hard work. Like, I think trans women are the bravest, like most amazing, beautiful things in the world, because, you know, instead of living their lives at the whim of other people, they're striking out on their own. I really want to leave this up here, and I want to make it very clear that Cash App is $Ayana Dio, because this is really important. If you have money, please donate to this Cash App. I'm going to tell you the story of Ayana Dior. People might be familiar with her and the story that recently came out. Ayana Dior, age 21, was recently filmed being attacked by a mob of people outside a Minneapolis gas station. She survived the attack. I have a question about that, which is, what does it mean for the city of Minneapolis to band together over the pain and suffering of a Black man while being silent on the pain and suffering of a Black trans woman? Accountability and responsibility is key when it comes to this liberation and resistance. So please consider donating to our Cash App. And I think that that's a really important thing to think about. You know, what does it mean that I think like the Black Lives Matter movement is amazing and it's important. And I think it's opened a door to also talking about Black trans women and trans women of color and working on these two things together and pushing them forward into the world and saying like, you know, it's not okay for Black people to be murdered or to be targeted and assaulted. And it's not okay for trans women, especially Black trans women, because they get it the worst. It's disproportionately Black trans women that are being murdered. But also second to that, Latinx trans women. It's all very frustrating. Like this week alone has been insane. Okay, just gonna reiterate, the Cash App is there. If you have Cash App, please send a donation. So this brings us to talking about liturgia. So I'm just gonna read a little bit about what my work is around. This is a poster for the new show that comes out on Thursday. And all of those details will be shared in the next slide. So, excuse me. Statistics show that in 2019, there are around 400 reported murder cases worldwide of trans persons. These are just reported cases. And remember, lots of reporters either misgender or it's up to the police officer there to gender or sex the person who's been murdered, and it doesn't always get counted. So it actually makes it quite difficult to make statistics around specifically trans women. My home state of Texas in the US makes up about 33 of those cases, all of which were persons of color. During my residency at A4 Sounds in Dublin, I've created a new series of work informed by the Catholic heritage of my upbringing and the current epidemic of trans death in society. The work draws comparisons between mythic religious iconography and the real tangible bodies of those whom we've lost in the trans community, creating a fantasy realm which builds new mythologies from the very real experience of trans women. The focal point of this work is the newest film entitled Liturgia, which translates from Spanish to liturgy, a form according to which public religious worship is conducted. The piece takes its title from the influences of Catholicism and the martyrdom of trans women. The film follows the story of a trans woman who is murdered and through death is transformed into a saint. The work seeks to bring attention to the pandemic of hate that the trans POC community is currently facing, creating a moment to reflect on and celebrate the trans community. I'm gonna shift over to this. So the show is opening this Thursday in 2 days, June 25th, and will begin at 5 p.m. via Zoom over at the A4 Sounds website. A link can be found in my Instagram bio at Kamehameha. I will be in conversation with Transgender Equality Network Ireland, Gender RIP, and Create from 6 p.m. And I hope to see you all there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Chris. Because we don't have the live audience, I'll do all the clapping now. Yeah, it's really powerful and quite sobering sort of aspects of what you're talking about. And I know we spoke actually last week actually about the topics of your talk, and you mentioned some very, very, very powerful statements at a certain point. I was asking you around the nature of your personal transition and the transitions that you've made in sort of like your history of all of your work as well, the catharsis that goes into your practice and how deeply, deeply personal it is, to the point that you're bearing your trauma in the photograph of the film. And I just wanted to ask if you wanted to share a little bit more thoughts.
Yeah, you know, I remember when we were chatting about that, I think, I mean, obviously there's like a lot there to unpack. I think like I use my camera. My camera is sort of like my lover. It almost feels like, that's like really cheesy to say, but it definitely feels like a part of, like an extension of myself. And further, like film is also kind of that, because it allows me to look at the way that I'm evolving, and also it allows me to scrutinize the parts of myself that I kind of hate. And there's this really great quote from Venus Extravaganza in Paris is Burning. And Venus Extravaganza was this trans woman who was murdered in a trans panic situation. They found her body under a bed in a hotel room. And it's a large part of that storyline. But she has this great quote where she says, "Isn't it amazing that as trans women, we get to create ourselves?" And I think that that's true. I think it's really, really amazing to be able to say, you know, not only are we disproportionately assaulted and we have so much, like, there's a lot of hardship, there's also a lot of trans joy, like, and to have like the total control over yourself to say, like, you know what, today I'm this and tomorrow I'm that, and learning sort of the performativity of those things and using them for yourself to take, you know, the sort of fantasy of what it means to be a cover girl for a magazine and live that for yourself on a Tuesday or a Wednesday, you know, to just believe that you have that in you. So why not apply it to your daily? And I think that playing with that fantasy is a little bit tongue in cheek, it's a little bit fun, but it's also quite serious because it allows you to see yourself the way that you should be seeing yourself, to celebrate your body the way it should be celebrated. And so I think that there's like a whole other conversation around, you know, like trans narratives being really sad. But I also would say that my work looks to also allow for trans joy and celebration, particularly Kamehameha and La Marena, I think really do that. I think the series of photographs really try to do that as well. And hopefully in Liturgia, you'll see it as well a little bit. I can't give too much away though.
I'm really, really looking forward to it. Can you maybe shed some light on sort of like components in the, maybe that's being a bit cheeky and asking too much, I guess.
You're being a little bit cheeky there, Bob. It's in 2 days. I won't give too much away.
Okay, yeah. Definitely going to be checking that out. And I was going to say it's a good time to open this up to the audience as well. So feel free to either type into the Q&A or like I mentioned before, do a raised hand in the participants box and I can unmute your microphone so you can talk to Chris directly. But we've already had a question from Jessica who says, amazing talk. I can't help but notice that works done in the UK have a marked turn towards exploring your Latinx roots. Can you speak more about what brought this theme into your work and, can you speak more about what brought this theme into your work and how have you been maintaining the Latinx identity so far from home?
This is an amazing question. I think just the utter whitewashing of my culture from like the space that I was living in actually made me refocus. And also I think coming into my womanhood and thinking about, you know, who are these women, who are these women that are iconic for me, and where do they come from, and what does that stem from? And there was definitely a divide between my culture, and you'll notice that a lot of my works are titled in Spanish as well, which I am not a fluent Spanish speaker. I don't think anyone who hears me speak Spanish could tell. But my thinking about how, you know, when I was younger, I pushed a lot of that away because unfortunately in my upbringing, it was like, you know, if you speak Spanish, you'll realize that there's a lot more racism that you'll experience in school, in like trying to get a job. You know, you don't want to be so close to Mexico. You want to be as far away from it. You really want to sort of ascertain to be white, which I really regret because actually I love my culture. And I think going back to like, I remember thinking of my grandmother speaking in Spanish at me and I would speak back at her in French because I get so frustrated. I'd be like, I don't know what you're saying. Like, but thinking about, you know, the nostalgia that has for me and the sort of power of coming back to my Latinx identity and thinking, you know, what does it mean to be Latina now? Like, and in this space where it's like white and like the food sucks and like, you know, like it's like coming back to those things. And actually I had conversations with my family quite a bit during this time about this, and I started to learn Spanish. I'm still not fluent, but I try to maintain that through not only making the work, but also trying to bring things back from my past into my life. You know, I don't really get homesick, but I do think of like sort of things like cooking or speaking in Spanish or little small things to sort of keep that with me. And also because I've experienced so much racism for being like visibly Latina, that it makes it's almost impossible. I couldn't have gone my whole life without, you know, really coming into it and sort of having to unpack that and ask myself the questions, you know, why is it that I was this way when I was young? And, you know, and now I'm very proud to be where I'm from, even though I had a terrible time living there.
That's a very shared, quite a very shared experience for younger children of colour. I can speak on, but we've got a bunch more questions, but from you talking then, it's just got me thinking a little bit about the sort of resistances in your ethnic background and your heritage and your community that you're from, with your sort of realization of your of transition and your sexuality. How was that experience for you, I guess?
With where I'm from?
With being Latino, Latinx.
Oh, yes. Yeah, it definitely makes that a feature in the work. You know, it was hard because when I was a kid, where I was from, men were supposed to be machismo. They needed to be like the breadwinners and this and that. And I never felt that way in my family, but like, because like Diane called the shots, but like, I don't know, I've always been very skeptical of men being in charge. So I think like, though immediately my experience of coming out as a queer person at a very young age, I think it was 13, and then having to live with it and being like the one gay in the village, it sucked. So, you know, I had struggled with my family at first and then sort of came around after a while. Now I'm the favorite, obviously. So, you know, it definitely, like the cultural part of that was definitely difficult because, you know, it's also super Catholic. And now with I think actually it's funny because like since transitioning, it's actually been easier to transition, mostly because I'm very close with my immediate family. I mean, it probably bothers them a little bit in a way that they're just sort of trying to understand because for them it's new. But like also culturally, we have like lemuses in Mexico, which is like a matriarchal trans like culture. If you don't know about lemuses, you should Google that. They're amazing. But I don't know. I think maybe for my family though, it also makes a lot of sense because like they're like Chris is so very much themselves. I feel like I'm just like a reflection of the women in my family.
Thank you. Got a few more questions now as well.
Sure.
I'll start with, this one's from Colette actually, who's one of the Mansions team. She says, thank you for your amazing talk, Chris. A lot of your photographic work seems to draw visual comparison with high fashion photography and religious iconography and painting, sometimes straddling the two. Is this part of an ongoing commentary or more of a style choice, a means of best presenting the concerns that you explore within your practice?
I think it's definitely an ongoing commentary. I think a lot about the sexuality of religion and sort of like the unspokenness. There's like a lot of like homoeroticism in that. And there's just like a lot of picking and choosing. It's like the Bible, you know, you pick and choose what you want to believe. Don't call me that. But I think straddling between high fashion and painting and what was the third thing?
It was high fashion photography, religious iconography, painting, yeah, those three things.
Religious iconography. I think that like image making has always been like, it grew and evolved through paintings of religion and I think that there's tons of references there that, you know, whether I want them there or not, they're there. But I think it definitely comes back to sort of that intimacy and sort of the things that I sort of I mean, I would say there's parts of me that are very honest within my photographs in that way, but there's also a lot of, I would say, not to trust everything that's in a photograph. So it's hard because I don't want to give too much away. I think about that. Like, I think that I do definitely play with those tropes, and I would say that it's definitely commentary.
Okay.
Yeah.
I've got another question. Thanks for speaking so generously and highlighting the vulnerability and precarity of trans experience. I wonder if there were marked shifts in the artwork and the cultural arena in terms of acceptance, understanding and representation in the various countries you have spent time in.
Absolutely, absolutely. You know, certain art, I mean, it's just like I said about London, like an art climate is different depending on what city you're in, and culturally as well. And to be a photographer in Asia is very different, especially Michael Ren, which is just a foreigner. It's difficult. You have to be very fluent in the language, and you need to be able to, you know, really work your butt off to get into spaces. And, you know, I did have some experiences where I was able to show my work, but I was often left out of spaces being like, who are you? Like, you have no business here. You're not Chinese, you're not Japanese. Like, but also just I mean, my work even before, I think was too much. It was too queer, too other for a lot of those spaces. I think specifically markedly in Japan, there's a lot of like street photography that's very popular, which is great, but my photographs, I think, were much too intimate. I did have some luck with a queer space in Shinjuku, but for the most part, yeah, I wasn't actually working as an artist in those spaces as much. It was more just commercial work and sort of keeping my head down and trying to figure out my life, because my life is such a mess. Like, yeah.
Okay. Got another one from West End Girl. Mm-hmm. In your travels with your art practice, have you always been free to realize the work you wanted to make? Have there been limitations in what you've encountered?
My whole practice is made on a hope, a wing, and a prayer, man. Like, ooh, I can, you know, it would just be so magical to get like thousands and thousands of dollars and just be like, go make the things that you want to make. And I think all artists are like this, especially like, you know, I have like a great privilege to be able to say that I went to art school twice, like as a trans woman of color from a small town. Like, I don't know how I did it. I still don't know how I did it. But yeah, like there were definitely limitations, like language barriers. First of all, I had to learn a lot of the languages for the places I was living. That's the first thing. The second thing was to get to really know the community, to be a part of it, because no one wants someone who's going to show up, be a tourist, photograph, or make art, and then, you know, leave. And it was never really my intention to leave any of the places that I was in. It just so happened that I did. Like, it wasn't like I was like, you know, having a grace period, you know, going to find myself. It definitely wasn't that. It was more like, okay, I need to pay my bills and I need to figure something out, and I'm already on this side of the world, so how do I do it, you know? So yeah, I think the freest I've ever been to realize the work that I wanted to make has actually been during this residency with A4, and that's just because Lisa Crown is a goddess. Like,
pretty good to hear. It'd be nice to meet her one day as well, and just see the outcomes of what you're going to be doing on Thursday as well. Another question coming up. They're all lining up quite nicely now, which is good. So further to your experience in London contemporary art scene, how do you see institutions and commercial galleries supporting trans artists and trans representation in their collections / roster following the Black Lives Matter movement? Also, thank you for sharing such powerful experiences and thoughts. Looking forward to the next show. Thanks, Anna.
Thank you. Thanks, Anna. So yeah, so there is definitely a conversation to be had, and I posted about this earlier this week, and I said, I posted a pretty racy photograph, and it was like, I mean, it's always been something that I'm thinking about, the way that queer POC bodies are used for their clout, or just POC bodies generally, like, you know, queer bodies as well. We are literally shown in the dark, ushered through the back door of the institution at the Tate Late, you know, for a small fee, but we're never on the walls of the institution. The people who are on the walls of the institution, the ones who have the most money or the most following, you know, you have to be cool enough. I'm not cool enough. Like, I don't feel cool. But at the same time,
That's a lie.
I think that people should be very aware of the way that they enter into the art world, and the people who do performance art specifically as well. Just like, you know, your clout is worth money. You know, your work is valuable. And just because you're queer or POC, or hell no, they should pay you twice as much. Like, it's very important. Like, and I remember sitting on a panel across from the woman who runs Tate Lakes, and we kind of got into it, but I was like, we need representation, pay us more, put us on your walls. Like, that's how I feel about that. Yeah.
Amazing. Another one, thank you for sharing your work. I was wondering if you could talk about the absence of digital and online tools or space in your work. I really enjoy seeing representation of queer life, so rooted in physical reality, domestic and urban spaces.
That's a very interesting question. You know, I think I personally have a really difficult time with the screen, which is hilarious because now it's COVID-19 and that's my life. But I think that there's something about touch and like physicality that's really important to me. And I would say that actually there's probably a shift in my practice now. I mean, the show on Thursday, the new work, I've moved more into things like sound production, and I won't say too much more. But those things, I think I'm really inspired by people who can and do those things. You know, like I think of Arca as like a really great example of a trans artist making music who's just really killing it and doing all kinds of amazing, interesting things. Danielle Braithwaite-Shirley, who is a Black trans artist in London, doing very important work to represent trans women of color, specifically the Black Trans Archive. She creates these amazing video games. And I am in awe of that ability to really create a fully fantasy space. Whereas I think for me, I sort of take, instead of putting the fantasy out there, completely creating it, I sort of take the fantasy and put it onto the reality, if that makes sense. Because I think that's sort of just how I've naturally come into it. I don't know if that answered.
No, I think it definitely did. I think that was an observation I've actually not made before about the sort of almost like a lack of digitality in your work, but I do personally find it really, really refreshing, and now to see just like the rawness of it all. And I think it speaks more about the practice itself and the experiences themselves. Anyways, the next question we've got is, thanks so much again for this talk. Having viewed your live performance and video work, I'm aware of the role that music plays in your work, both in conveying narrative and creating spaces. So I'm curious whether music making from scratch and music technologies may have ever become an element in your practice. I'm thinking a little of artists like Terry Temil, sorry, I don't know how to pronounce the name, from whom electronic and dance music are frames/mediums in which gender identity, sexuality, and class are explored.
I think you should come to the show on Thursday and find out. I definitely do. You know, I think I always ask myself, or I guess I've begun to ask myself this question about what a trans space is and what can it be? And I think, or what those spaces have been for me. And I think the club is definitely one of them. A rave, you know, the bedroom, these sorts of things, the bathroom even. And I think about music a lot as a way to, and dance as a way to celebrate and perform it, like physical performances, vocal performances, dance performances, as a ways to like get things out. Like for me, Bob, you know this, but I'm obsessed with karaoke. I go like everywhere. And it's a big part of my practice. Singing is a big part of my practice now, which is kind of funny because I'm an amateur singer at best, but like, for me, it's not so much about the ability to sing, it's more about the ability to just really get something out. And dancing as well for me is very much that. It's also very steeped in queerness and transness. I mean, our community built the ballroom, you know. Yeah.
You talked about your artwork being somewhat cathartic for you. Do you find it's hard to look back at it? Powerful talk. Thank you so much.
Oh my gosh, yes, absolutely. When I was putting together this talk, it was so weird to look back at images of me like age 15 and like, you know, like to look through, because there's I have thousands of photographs, you know, and there's a lot of stuff that's not on my site anymore, you know, just like projects I was making when I was starting to learn how to think critically about, you know, art. And yeah, it is difficult to look back, but it's also kind of nice to remind yourself, you know, where you came from. And like, you know, sometimes also it's like, why didn't I follow through with that idea? Or, you know, where is that? And then you suddenly kind of find it in other spaces in your work. Really funny is I remember going for my first portfolio review ever for to try and get into college. And I remember they told me, you should be a filmmaker. And now I'm making films. Which is hilarious.
Next question, we've actually got our Camille Brechnier. She's coming in with a 2-for-1. So question number 1, having worked with you before, I know that you see performance as a very powerful political tool. It's quite original for photographers to work with performance. So I thought I'd be interested for you to talk about its relation to film and photography and your lived experience.
So I think the thing that naturally evolved from photographing was performance, because I was performing for my camera when I was photographing myself. So to be able to do it and then show the time pass and the physicality of that was very important. And thinking about, you know, methods of filmmaking, not using so much I mean, I started with 16mm more recently, and really getting into that because it has the same sort of feel. There's something about it that still feels very real. And I'm sorry, I'm just reading this question again. It's quite repetitive. I think also just as a way to like, I think in my practice, like a lot of what I do is just taking a snippet from my life and then putting it again in front of something like a camera, or and deciding whether or not that should be still or moving. And so, you know, I take all of this, these terrible experiences that I've had, or these great ones, and I put them into, you know, dances. I put them into vocals. You know, I put them into monologues. I do a lot of writing, and I think performance just was a really natural move for me. Which was also happening when I was doing my undergrad. So actually we've been doing performance for just as long, just didn't show it as much really.
Camille's second question is, this is kind of linked to Anna's question, but I was wondering if you could talk about your networks of support, the artists, curators, spaces, and thinkers that inspire you, that lift you up and push you and your practice further, which I think is a really, really nice question. And I know you're a part of such a really, really great community right now in Ireland as well. So yeah. Share.
Yeah, I'm gonna shout out the girls. Like, I am very fortunate in the fact that I have had so much support from my friends who are my fellow artists and many curators, Camille being one of them. I mean, we talked about the show. Also you, Bob. I think thinking about you know, spaces as well, like community spaces. I've been incredibly lucky to come into Dublin and be tossed right into the trans community. Lilith at Tenny has been a great connect. Being able to like get in there, have these conversations, begin these dialogues, to meet people who are like myself, who I've never actually really had the opportunity to. I mean, I've met a few trans people in London, but it's a very different kind of community than the one in Dublin. And it's quite noticeable. And to be able to do things like this, as opposed to like this, you know, it's been really,
There's another question here, but it's again along regarding the residency in Ireland. It sounds like the circumstances and restrictions of COVID have perhaps elongated and enriched your residency in Ireland in unexpected ways. Would you say that this has been the case?
Definitely, absolutely. Having been in Ireland for much longer than I had originally, had originally planned, it changed a lot of things about the work. You know, the original idea for this work involved 7 performers, which was not going to happen in COVID-19. And you know, really thinking about what it means to just peel it all back, take out all the bells and whistles and just do it on your own and figure it out. And I remember I definitely had like moments where I was like, you know, for my own self, like having to deal with like learning how to live in this new space where I'm an incredibly social person. I don't do so well being trapped indoors, and learning how to make again in that way, or just even begin to write and find other methods of making. And I think this goes back to sort of music as well, thinking about, you know, what is possible digitally, what are things that I can do. And again, I think my support networks have been amazing. People at A4, my friends over in London, keeping in contact, having like wine and whiskey on Fridays, you know, like it's been a wild, wild ride, this residency. And I'm really hoping on Thursday, people get to see something that will move them and will urge them to have more conversations around these topics. And next time that they see someone who is facing something that is, you know, terrible, any kind of discrimination in public, or someone is like yelling after a trans woman, that you go over there and you stop them, you know, like I'm really hoping that something changes. But yeah.
Right. I've actually got a little bit of a question about citizenship and belonging to a particular place, because you've moved so much. And I imagine within that, there would have been experiences where travel might have been, your rights to travel or your rights of citizenship would have been really drastically affected. I don't know, how do they play into things for you?
There's so many things.
It's not like a prying question at all.
No. There's definitely things I could say, but I won't speak about that until much later. But I think the number one thing is sort of realizing the accessibility of what it is to be a European citizen. To have to go back to somewhere like America, because I am on a tourist visa at this moment. And unfortunately, to get a visa in London, it's so expensive, and me not being wealthy makes it quite difficult. It's like $3,000. And, you know, like trying to make $1 and like, you know, get yourself housing and like being able to survive as an artist, it's hard work. Like you grind your ass off every day and you hope that, you know, someone will think that your work is important. And I mean, I don't do it for that. I do it because I love it, you know, and I have to do it. If I don't make art, I'm incredibly depressed. But I mean, the accessibility of the art world is something that should be addressed, and I think needs to be talked about even more. You know, what is it to be able to be an artist now? What are the things that you need to be able to access that world? And this comes back to sort of class drag, you know, how do you fake it till you make it? And girl, I have become a master of disguise. Like, I'm sure you know, Miss Bob, like, it's absolutely a lot of work. And I think that that's a really great question, like to be able to find ways to strike out and make it for yourself and to get the support that you need. And, you know, sometimes that's small. It doesn't always need to be like, oh, I've got a huge residency and this and that. Sometimes it's as small as being able to go over to a friend's house for dinner and wine, you know, like that's definitely gotten me through a lot of this.
A couple more. I think this will have to be the last few because we've already got about 5 minutes left.
Sure.
But Beth from the Mansions team says, how do you find the strength to continue to come back to the lens, especially as self-portraiture feels like it needs so much strength?
That's a really good question, and it's something I ask myself all the time. I actually, and I think a big thing about this residency was like, okay, Chris, I'm not going to make work using myself. And that's why I wanted so many other performers. And then COVID-19 happened. And, you know, it is really hard. It's really hard to continue to look at the self, because I'm so critical of myself. I'm such a perfectionist. I drive everyone around me crazy with it. And I think it also, like, forcing myself to do that has been also like really eye-opening for myself in other ways, like thinking about my daily and, you know, getting like I said before, taking a little bit of that performance from the work and applying it to my daily, it makes me a stronger person, I think. And I definitely do feel like a very powerful person in my own little box.
We find that's also the case in boxes outside of your own. Final question from Danny Ash. Yeah. Have you had time to stop and reflect on your practice while in Ireland during lockdown? Have there been times when you've decided to stop making work to reflect?
Absolutely. There was a period about 3 months, or not 3 months, what am I saying? There was a period of about a month during all of this that I had to stop completely, because everything that I had worked on for 3 months, it was like the show was going to happen and then it couldn't happen. And everything that I had planned was just scrapped. Not really. Like, the research is, all of the makings of that have evolved into what's coming on Thursday. And actually, I think it is stronger now because of that. But I definitely did spend a month doing a lot of reading and a lot of writing, and just, like, you know, starting other projects even. You know, I started doing collaborative work with my friend Kyle, who you also know, which will see the light of day at some point, which was really healthy. And I'm so glad that situation came along, because it actually did help me to sort of step away from the work and to really think about the other things, you know, 'cause doing this kind of research and looking at these really dark subjects and thinking about my transness, you know, my transness doesn't define me. It's just like, I'm trans, and, you know, having to think about it a lot all the time and having to do the work to educate everybody, it's exhausting. So absolutely, I have definitely done that. And like I said before, previously in my life, when things sort of became really difficult for me, I took a year. There was a year where I wasn't making any art. I was just working, trying to save money in that. Like, and I think that year was actually really big for me as well, because I think that was the year that decided whether or not I would continue to be an artist. And I'm glad that I did. And I'm still very glad that I'm an artist. But yeah, I think a little bit of downtime before the next thing after this.
Chris, thank you so much for sharing all of your time today. Before we all go, I just wanted to say that our next LCN talk is going to be with professional wrestling researcher Sam West, which is on Tuesday, 7th of July. Also, our Lincoln Live season, we have a number of online events and opportunities coming up, including live communal lunches, talks, and a regional summer school opportunity. Please see the website for all of our details. Check out our Instagram. Likewise, check out Chris's Instagram and A4 Sounds. A little reminder again, if we haven't talked about it enough already, is Chris's show is coming up this Thursday, 25th of June at A4 Sounds Gallery. It will be broadcast at 5 p.m, I believe, and then at 6 p.m, you're going to be in conversation. Yeah?
Yes, exactly.
Perfect. Amazing. Thank you very much, everyone. And thank you, Chris.
Me, I really appreciate it. It was so lovely to sit and chat, yeah?
Definitely. I really look forward to having a drink with you again at some point in the hopefully near future.
Yes, hopefully in the very near future.
See you.
Bye.